All right. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us here at the U.S. Institute of Peace for this event on Pakistan's elections. All of you know, July 25th, Pakistan had its second consecutive transition to democratic rule under a civilian, fully civilian administration. This is the first time in Pakistan's history that a decade has been crossed this way. Transformative in the sense of the argument that if you let the electoral processes take root over time, you see democratic consolidation. So in that sense, I think it's a clear positive. On the other hand, the elections were under a cloud much before they took place. There were a lot of controversies around whether this was a level playing field or not. After the elections, the EU mission that was present came out saying that election day was okay, but then pre-poll, it was not a level playing field. What they're referring to, of course, is the then incumbent Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz, Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif at the time, of course, now in jail on corruption charges, and the allegation there was that his party was systematically disrupted in terms of their ability to campaign and sort of have their candidates of their free will, etc. There are also question marks on what role the judiciary and the military in Pakistan played. So those questions have remained, and if you followed the coverage in the US and most of the West, I would argue, that's been the real focus. The real question marks on this have been about the fairness of the election. I tune into Pakistan and the conversation is very different, and I would say it's net optimistic in terms of new government, what happens to governance, where does Pakistan go? So there's a bit of a dichotomy there in terms of how we are coming at this. There have been other events around town on Pakistani elections in the past week or so, as you would expect. And as we thought through this at USIP, we thought there was one missing element. And the missing element was to actually hear from Pakistan's largest parties, including the in-waiting government, on how they see the situation, both in terms of elections, but more importantly, going forward. What is the future of democracy for Pakistan, US-Pakistan relationship? And so what we've done here is brought together representatives from the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaaf, the government in waiting, the Pakistan Muslim League, Nawaz, Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, former Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif's party, and then the Pakistan People's Party, led by Bilawal Bhutto Zardari, the son of the slain former Pakistani Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto. We will tie that up with a stellar panel here. To my left, Dan Markey from SAIS, Johns Hopkins, and our own Jumaina Siddiqui from USIP, to have a conversation about what we hear from the political representatives. I've been suitably warned, and I know that this is going to be a bit complicated. For those of you who know me, you know my deep lack of love for technology, but today it's all technology. We've got 3 Pakistani senior politicians tuning in through something like Skype. I don't know what it is, but you will be able to see them and they will talk to you.
Magic.
Magic, exactly right, for me. We've requested them to speak for about 10 minutes each. We're going to have them one at a time. They won't be, all 3 won't be together. Otherwise, we risk making it a Pakistani TV talk show. They'll be there for 10 minutes, they'll speak, and then we'll be able to ask them questions for about 10 minutes. I'll ask my panel, I'll ask you, we'll move to the second party, and then the third, in the order of the Pakistan People's Party, the Muslim League Nawaz, and then the PTI. And then, once that is done, we'll turn to our panel and then open it up for questions, and we hope to end by 11:30 or so. Let me take this opportunity to introduce my panel, and then I'll introduce our guests from political parties as they speak. Dan Markey, to my left, Senior Research Professor at Johns Hopkins, SAIS, as I mentioned. Before this, for 8 years, he was at the Council on Foreign Relations as a Senior Fellow on South Asia. His book, No Exit from Pakistan, America's Tortured Relationship with Islamabad, is a must-read if you follow US-Pakistan relations. And before that, Dan was at the State Department with the policy planning staff. He's taught at Princeton and much else. And thank you for being here. It's also a great honor and privilege to be introducing Jumaina Siddiqui, who's at USIP as Senior Program Officer, leads a lot of our work on Pakistan, and is an election specialist, spent a number of years at the National Democratic Institute, and is well-versed with election technicalities and elections in Pakistan. Also has led a lot of USIP's work on elections since she's been here. Jumaina and I continue to debate because I'm, again, not a technical person, so I keep looking at the big picture and she keeps telling me you don't understand elections. With that, first test of technology, we should have our first honorable guest from the Pakistan People's Party, Syed Naveed Qamar. Honorable Naveed Qamar is a renowned politician in Pakistan from a well-known political family of the province of Sindh. His grandfather was the first Speaker of the Sindh Assembly after Pakistan was created. He also holds the record of contesting elections continuously since 1990 and basically winning every time that he contests, and has been a regular member of the National Assembly in Pakistan, member of the Central Executive Committee of the Pakistan People's Party, but most importantly, I think nobody comes close to him in terms of the number of ministers' portfolios that he's held. Defense, finance, water, power, petroleum, natural resources, and privatization over time. So if you want to get somebody who understands how Pakistan operates and how decisions are made, he is probably the best one around. So, Naveed Saab, can you hear me?
I can hear you. I hope you can hear me.
I can. This is lovely. Before this, either one of us fails to say that, let's go. Thank you very much for joining us. We have the audience here and we're waiting to hear from you.
Okay. Are you going to ask the questions and do I respond? Or?
No, I think what I would like to do is, if you want to give an opening statement, so how does the PPP see the elections? How do you see sort of the future of democracy in Pakistan? And then we'll come to our panel and audience to ask you a few questions, if that's okay.
Okay. Basically, as you know, Pakistan is going through the third consecutive transition from one civilian government to another. So in that sense, I think we can start with the positive note that there is a lot of optimism in terms of survival of parliamentary democracy in Pakistan. However, obviously the way the elections have been conducted leaves a lot to be desired in terms of the expectation that it will be a completely free and fair election after all the election reforms that we went through, new laws were in place. But unfortunately, what came out in the end was a process which was questioned by almost all and sundry. It did not matter if you won the election or you lost the election. The fact remains that Pakistan has almost a century-old tradition of holding elections. So some of the things which are taken as the almost the gospel truth in terms of having polling agents who sit through the election process, I'm talking of the polling day, and the polling takes place in front of them, and then the counting takes place, and ultimately the results are transmitted, has always been done. This is the first time that there were serious questions about polling agents of the candidates not being present during the counting process, and therefore a black mark on how many votes were actually cast or counted in that period. And on top of it, there was such a long delay in the way the election results were transmitted. It almost took, in a lot of cases, up to 48 hours to go from the start of the polling till the polling results came out. This of course, and a number of things, the RTS system, the results transmission system, that broke down in the middle of the whole process. This on top of what was considered the pre-poll rigging process, which was that people were being pressurized to join or at least support certain political parties which were being patronized, and others that were not patronized were in some ways, there were hurdles for the candidates or the parties themselves. Uh, all in all, having said that, the fact remains that today we do have a parliament, the elections have been held, and the Pakistan People's Party, along with the other opposition parties, intend to go into parliament rather than to boycott the parliament as was being already suggested. And then all these issues will be raised within parliament, along with all the other national issues that do come up there. The numbers game is almost complete, if not entirely. So it seems clear that the PTIs would be forming the next government, but will be facing a fairly formidable opposition, probably the largest in numerical terms in Pakistan's history. So we need to see how the government operates, how much do they live up to the promises that they have made. And believe me, they have made very tall promises. And obviously, the opposition will be there to keep an eye and a check on all the things, all the benchmarks that have been set by the winning party, the PTI itself. And certainly, PPP is coming in to the parliament this time with its top leadership, both Bilawal Bhutto Zardari and his father, the former president, Asif Ali Zardari, are both in parliament for the first time. So in that sense, we will be well led and well represented in this entire process. And we hope that the various political parties that are there will play their positive role in this whole game.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction. So let me ask Jumaina, Dan, if you want to start with any questions for Mr. Kama, and then we'll ask the audience if there are a couple.
Yeah, I have one question, Naveed Sab. This is Jumaina Siddiqui. Now that the polling station level data has been released today, is PPP planning on tracking where party agents have said that there were irregularities, they weren't allowed to witness the count, and will be going through the technical legal processes to dispute those results? And what's the game plan moving forward? What will PPP be doing next?
Yes, we have already started that process. All the candidates that had complained during the entire day of polling have been asked now to compile the various issues that came up on that particular day, along with the names of the not only the polling station, polling staff, and whatever else was the complaint. And we intend to come through with a compiled, we may call it white paper, or at least a comprehensive report. And other parties are doing the same. And now, hopefully, that when the website, the ECP website has been provided with the results, we may check it. However, there are skeptics who do say that the entire idea of giving the results on the day of the polling is that you know that these are the votes that have been counted, and these are votes that have come out of the box. Giving those about almost 10 and 12 days later, you never know what kind of a manipulation may have taken place. Nevertheless, it's still something to work with.
I do have a question, and I'll go back to some of Moeed's broader points, and less technical. And it has to do with this observation at the outset that you made that this election should be considered a success because it means the survival of the parliament and at some level a consolidation of Pakistani democracy. But I think a different way of interpreting it, a much more skeptical way, would be to say that we've seen a steady deterioration of civilian control over Pakistan since 2008. And I wonder how you would interpret that. In other words, over a decade, in terms of civilian control and democracy in Pakistan, have things gotten better or have things gotten worse?
I would tend to agree with you to the extent that while we can take solace in the fact that the process goes on, because there were a lot of skeptics even on that, whether we will have elections or not, whether there will be a military coup, whether there will be a complete sort of overthrow of the system. That did not take place. We did have elections. We did have people taking part in that, and so on. So, and there, hopefully, within the next few days, we will see a transition to a new government. So, at least the entire outer veneer is very nice, and one can be grateful for that. However, yes, the amount of interference, both in the process of selecting a new government and as one can presume in the running of the government, will still be under the cloud, both because of the way it has been, the process has taken place, as well as some of the things that were happening, at least in the later half of the government of Mian Nawaz Sharif, where there was a constant institutional clash between the executive, the judiciary, and the military establishment.
Okay, let's see if we have any questions here in the audience. We have a mic right at the back. For those of you who don't know, that's my boss. I've got to allow him to ask a question. Go for it.
I get the first.
Keep it short.
Andrew Wilder, USIP. I wanted to maybe follow up on Dan's comment and ask a little bit about the Charter of Democracy, which of course was signed in 2006 between Benazir Bhutto and Nawaz Sharif as an effort to how do we strengthen the civilian side and rectify the civil-military imbalance in politics. And I have to say we didn't see much evidence of PPP or PML-N collaboration in the lead up to this election when it didn't always appear that the playing field was completely level. So I guess my question is the Charter of Democracy dead? Do you see any possibility of reviving it and perhaps even including the PTI in that process?
Well, no, in my opinion, Charter of Democracy is not dead. In fact, a lot of it has already been implemented in terms of the 18th Amendment to the Constitution and some of the other reforms that have come in. However, there's a long ways to go. And every time the civilians do come up with a method of doing things, there are always ways to counter it. So, yes, there is a need for revitalizing the Charter of Democracy and include all political parties, including the PTI, in the process, because there's no point having a charter between only certain parties and others being kept out of it. However, I must clarify that the charter was not a document to be partners in any government or, for that matter, opposition, but certain ground rules were laid out under which it was hoped that if these are followed, then we will have a fairly strong parliamentary democracy going on in the country. So, yes, some of it was followed and some of it definitely it still needs to be implemented.
Okay. We have a question here, but while the mic comes, Dan, you had another question.
Yeah, just very quickly, what do you anticipate are the likely first moves of this PTI government? And if you could impress upon them your perspective, what should be their first moves as they come into power?
Well, obviously, as I said, they have made very tall promises, and they are coming in to handle a very difficult situation, particularly on the economic side. Pakistan has got a very serious current account deficit, and we are running out of our dollar reserves. A lot of people are suggesting, including perhaps their anticipated finance minister, that Pakistan may have to go to IMF almost immediately upon taking over of the new government. Of course, the IMF program never comes without heavy conditionalities, and especially if it is not in good books with the US or the European Union. Uh,
Naveed,
for that matter. So,
sorry, you cut out a little bit the last minute or so. If you want to just repeat the last part of your answer.
I think the government will have to take some very tough decisions, as I was saying, because the IMF program may come with some very strict conditionalities, both on the political side as well as the economic side. And any new government going in has to be honest and forthright with its people to say that this is a bitter pill that they all will have to swallow. So the initial days will not be, it will be a honeymoon, but it will be a very rocky honeymoon.
Okay. Doesn't sound good. So we'll take two questions here, right here, and then we'll let Mr. Kamar go because we promised we'll let him go at 10 a.m.
Mr. Naveed Kamar, I'm Sufi Lagari. I'm from your own constituency, Hyderabad, Baksho Lagari. You know that. So I have a question about
my former constituency, yes.
Yes,
okay.
But my question is, enforced disappearance is a very big issue in Sindh. Hundreds and hundreds of people are disappearing in Sindh. Writers, journalists, even teachers and innocent people. Your third time, your party is actually come out in the power, haven't done anything. And corruption and education issues and land reform, I see even because of the your party is a landlord party, that's why they win the election. But the issue is, I don't know what are you going to do during this tenure. Okay. Thank you.
Well, obviously, there are things that we have done which have enabled the electorate to vote for us one more time. But still, there is a lot that needs to be done. Obviously, yes, there are certain things which are the priorities of the present government or the party, I should say. And we want to deliver to the people in general. There are certain things that people also realize are within the ambit of any civilian government. For example, the issue of missing persons has been dealt with by different parties as well as the different judicial fora. And yet, there is a lot that is desired on that account. So yes, the entire society, both the civil government as well as the civil society, has to keep on pushing on this agenda so that we can come to some desirable conclusion on that issue.
Polly?
Yes, I'm Polly Nayak, and I have a question that concerns the opposition, including you, to the government we all expect to be seated. And assuming that goes forward, where do you come out on your party supporting an economic effort by the new government that would include asking for IMF help? Are you inclined to, do you believe that for the good of Pakistan, that is what your party should do? Or is this an opportunity to hold the new government hostage on economic issues?
Well, I think any new government coming in always gets some leeway, both from the people as well as from the opposition. So to that extent, I think there will be cooperation, but a lot will depend on the program that the government itself comes out with and how it's presented and how it's sold. Certainly, as I said, we are all Pakistanis. We have the national interest at our heart. Nevertheless, it's also our job as opposition to keep a check on what the government intends to do and how it goes about doing it. There's a lot of cosmetic things that the government has started talking about. However, what we need to look at is what is the meat of it. And once the meat comes out, then only can we comment on whether they will get the support of the opposition or not.
Mr. Kamath, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a pleasure, and I want to thank you especially because I know we've been working the past few hours to make sure that technology and everything works out, and it worked out perfectly. So, great start. But thank you so much for joining us and giving your perspective, and we'll now continue with the rest of the program. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
I'm right on time, my friend. So we will now move on to the Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz representative. I just want to clarify for those of you who may not have seen the changed announcement because it came out late, and I should have mentioned this earlier. We did have a change in lineup from the original sort of list that we had put out. As you can imagine, this is a time of great political interest and activity in Pakistan. Ambassador Senator Sherry Rahman, who was originally slated to speak, apparently the Senate has a vote today, and so she had to move to that and asked Naveed Qamar to join us. And then for the Tehreek-e-Insaaf, we had Shah Mahmood Qureshi listed, who requested Mr. Asad Umar, the Minister in Waiting on Finance, to join because I think part of the understanding was that there will be a lot of interest in questions around what we just heard, IMF, etc. So I think he'll be in a better place to answer that. So he'll be joining us from the PTI in about 20 minutes or so. Also, while we are waiting, I just wanted to give you a sense, I'm sure all of you know this, of where the political landscape in Pakistan has ended up. Now, some of these numbers will change a little bit as the Election Commission finalizes results, but at this point, this is how things look. The National Assembly, the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaaf has 116 seats, the Muslim League Nawaz 64, and the People's Party 43. Of course, the total doesn't, total is larger, but these are the top three parties, and that's why the PTI is in as the front runner as the party that's going to form government. The largest province of Punjab was actually neck to neck between the Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz and the PTI. The jury is still out. I think from everything I am picking up, PTI is probably more likely to be able to form a coalition government, but I think the Nawaz League has not sort of given up the effort to try and see if they can cobble together some of the independents and other smaller parties to form government. The KP province is absolutely clear. I mean, the PTI had a sweep. They were in government, in a coalition government for the last 5 years, and now actually they do not need a coalition in the province. They can form a government by themselves. In Sindh, it's the Pakistan People's Party. We just heard from Syed Naveed Qamar. Again, it's pretty much a sweep, and there isn't a need for any coalition. Balochistan has always historically been a coalition sort of government arrangement. It's always provincial parties that take the lead usually, and so you have the Balochistan Awami Party with 15 seats, and then the Religious Alliance, the Alliance of Religious Parties with 8, and then another Baloch party with 6. And here I hear that it's going to be a coalition government, probably with one of the larger parties, but with these parties in the lead. So that's how sort of the election has turned up. Of course, all of you know that Pakistan, after the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, is a federated unit in spirit, which means that a lot of the powers now lie with the provinces, not with the central government. So it's as important for whoever is forming government in the center to try and get as many provinces under its control as possible, Punjab being the largest prize. So we now have, I understand, Syed Tariq Fatemi online from the Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz. Mr. Fatemi was the special assistant to the Prime Minister of Pakistan, Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif at the time, on foreign affairs with a rank of Minister of State. He, before that, has a distinguished diplomatic career in the Pakistan Foreign Service to his credit of about 35 years and served in Moscow, Beijing, and Washington. And if you're in the Pakistani Foreign Service, these are the three capitals to hit if you want to make a successful career out of it, and he did. He was also the additional foreign secretary in the Prime Minister's office back in the day when Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif was in office for in the 1990s, and somebody who I've known for years, respect dearly, has also been a good friend of the institute here and has been here multiple times before. Fatemi Sahab, can you hear me? Please say yes. Silence is not good. Fatemi Sahab, can you hear me?
If you will speak just a little louder.
Okay. Am I audible?
Yep, fine.
Lovely, and we can hear you loud and clear. So again, before I fail to say that, why don't I turn it over to you for a rundown on the elections and where you think things are, and then we'll have our audience and our panel ask a few questions if that's okay.
Okay, so you want me to first focus on the elections, is that right?
It's your time. Elections, foreign policy, I mean, you know.
Oh, okay. Well, as far as the elections go, virtually everybody has commented on it, and there is not much of a track record because we have had so few elections. In fact, we have had more military interventions than general elections. But yes, in the weeks and months prior to the elections, some of the actions taken by the various government departments and agencies did cause a lot of concern. Major journalists were taken off the air, TV programs were shut down, large number of party MNAs belonging to the PML-N were asked to abandon the party and join the independents. So there was a common impression all over the country that some of the state agencies were actually trying to assist the PTI in its election campaign. And then finally, I think the last straw was when the judgment was passed on Nawaz Sharif, his daughter and son-in-law, just days before the election. And when they came back, their bail applications were not accepted. So anyway, the PTI has won, and I think it's a good sign, maturity on the part of the opposition, that while they will protest, they will join the parliament, they'll participate in its proceedings, and that is a helpful sign. PTI's majority in the National Assembly will be very thin. They will not be present in the Senate either. So in both houses, I expect them to have considerable problems in enacting major legislation, unless the legislation is of a nature in which they are able to gain the support of the other political parties. Particularly when it comes to major enactment that goes against the wishes of the other parties, I don't see that taking place. Now, as regards the foreign policy issues, first of all, there is no doubt that Pakistan's relations with the USA will remain the most important, uppermost in our minds. The US will remain a very important player for Pakistan because of its strong interest in the region. For the foreseeable future, I see the US and NATO troops staying on in Afghanistan. I see the US continuing with its present policy of bolstering India as a potential counterweight to China. I continue to see Washington's relations with Iran remaining in a very difficult stage. And for all these reasons and many more which I will list, I think the US interest in this part of the world will remain very strong. But whether that interest can be translated into something positive and meaningful for Pakistan is a question that continues to trouble me, because the divided and somewhat confused nature of the administration in Washington and their inability to focus on anything positive or constructive with any country. I mean, if allies are being dumped, if NATO is being trashed, and trade war initiated with China, I don't see much of a positive initiative being taken by Washington to improve its relations with Pakistan. So the troubled areas will continue to be the ones that we know for sure. American complaints regarding Pakistan's policy on Afghanistan, that Pakistan is not doing enough, that Pakistan is not promoting reconciliation in Afghanistan as much as it should. Then second point, which will be, continue to be raised, is the US complaint that Pakistan continues to harbor the Taliban, particularly the Haqqani network, other non-state actors. Now, how does the government of Mr. Imran Khan handle these challenges? Because Mr. Nawaz Sharif tried his level best to convince the other stakeholders in Pakistan that it was no longer of advantage to Pakistan to permit these characters to stay on and use Pakistan's territory. So that's a trouble area. Then, of course, I see him, Mr. Imran Khan, facing major crisis in the next few weeks on FATF, the American and the anti-terrorism funding organization, having placed Pakistan in the grey list. And Pakistan has been responding, and I'm told has sent some responses and answers to the questionnaire submitted to them. But whether it will suffice with the United States, I have my serious doubts. Then I see problems for Mr. Imran Khan in relations with India. He has made all the right noises, very positive comments in his victory speech. But Mr. Nawaz Sharif, and for that matter, even the government before him, Mr. Zardari's government and Prime Minister Jirani, they did try to improve relations with India. But when it comes to resolving the core problems with India, there is no response from the Indian side. If anything, Mr. Modi has adopted an extremely intransigent, hostile attitude towards Pakistan. He has rejected all offers of dialogue between the two countries. He has sabotaged the SAARC summit, the only organization that relates to economic growth and cooperation in South Asia. And the rhetoric within India and the Indian government's policies towards the minorities in India and its repressive actions in Kashmir make it that much more difficult for Mr. Imran Khan to get the kind of opening that he needs to have in order to carry the other important stakeholders in Pakistan on a policy that could improve relations with India. But finally, Secretary Pompeo's statement a few days ago intrigued me. I thought it was totally unnecessary, inappropriate, and not helpful at all for him to step in and warn Pakistan not to seek assistance from the IMF and to warn the IMF that the United States would monitor its decisions doesn't speak well of the manner in which a great power like the United States should be conducting its foreign policy, but that is for Secretary Pompeo to decide. But nevertheless, we in Pakistan were surprised, deeply disappointed, because there is no doubt that with a very small foreign exchange available, with decreasing exports, with rising inflation, and with a budget deficit that is mounting by the day, there is no way that Mr. Imran Khan can do without a massive infusion of assistance from the IMF. The likely finance minister has indicated that he too is working on a plan to approach the IMF. Now, the IMF assistance as well as continued assistance from China would be absolutely essential for the government of Pakistan to maintain even the normal working of the various government agencies, as well as continuing the projects that have been started in the last 3-4 years. And while one hears that the Chinese are prepared to be helpful, but they will be helpful to only a certain extent. So therefore, I see a host of problems for Mr. Imran Khan and his team in the coming months and years, both as far as domestic front issues are concerned, as well as foreign policy issues. Thank you. Moeed.
Thank you very much, Fatemi sir, for this introduction and your remarks. Let me ask Jumaina and Dan. We have Dan Markey here and Jumaina Siddiqui with us. If you have any questions, then
I'll kick it off. Thanks for your opener, really very useful. I guess my core question would be to pick up at the end of what you were talking about with respect to China, and to ask whether you anticipate that the PTI government might take a somewhat different approach in its relationship with China than the PML-N government did. Of course, this was a core issue for PML-N, and CPEC has been a dominant part of Pakistan's foreign policy over the past several years. So I wonder if you anticipate any changes there, because there have been a number of criticisms of CPEC and of the handling of that, and in particular of the contracting and some lack of transparency, questions related to that over the past several years. How do you expect that PTI might manage that going forward?
Is that question for me?
It is.
you are the only speaker, sir. Yes,
Hello.
It is for you, sir.
Okay. Dan, first of all, good evening and good morning to you here. Good to see you and to hear you. I do not think that there will be any change in the PTI government's approach and attitude to China. The Chinese ambassador has been one of the first visitors to call on Mr. Imran Khan. And from what I hear from both quarters, there has been a very powerful reiteration on the part of both sides to not merely maintain the relationship, but to further strengthen and fortify. Yes, it is true that Mr. Nawaz Sharif, through his very personal involvement and interest in CPEC projects, managed to raise the profile of Pakistan-China relations to unprecedented heights. But there is no doubt that notwithstanding a few voices of dissent, overall these projects have been very well received. All the political parties are on board. The PTI was only critical about it because they felt, or rather they alleged, that most of that aid was going to Punjab and less to frontier. And in one of the last meetings that the two sides had, the two countries had at the level of ministers, which was participated by all the 4 chief ministers, in fact, the KP chief minister was the one who was asking for far greater assistance and far greater involvement of China in the establishment of projects in his province, and especially in establishing the industrial zone that is envisaged later on to be established in all the 4 provinces, as well as Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan.
Great, thank you. Jumaina?
Yes, Fatemi Saab, you had mentioned that PTI's majority in parliament is a slim majority and that they will have difficulty getting major legislation passed. And they've ruled out an ambitious 100-day plan. Do you have a sense in your conversations what, as PML-N in the opposition, would push back on based on the rhetoric that PTI said that they want to do in the first 100 days?
Well, both you and I have witnessed many elections, and other than FDR doing something in 100 days, I'm not aware of anyone else having achieved anything. And here they have not been able to decide who the chief minister of KP should be, because the last incumbent refuses to leave, and Mr. Imran wants to bring somebody else. They are unable to decide who the Chief Minister of Punjab should be. There is a battle royal going on as regards distribution of portfolios. So I think the 100-day plan will remain that, rhetoric and not anything substantial. What I meant to say was that with a very small majority in the lower house and a majority based on the support of a large number of independents, as well as very small injections from parties such as the PML-N, the MQM, and today the Balochistan group. It will be very difficult for them to agree internally before they can actually present the legislation to the National Assembly, point one. Point two, in our system, the Senate exercises also considerable leeway other than on the money bill, and therefore I expect the Senate, which is firmly in the hands of the opposition, to be very watchful and to keep a vigilant eye on what the government proposes. So it will be tough going for them.
Okay, thank you. Let's see if there's a question from the audience. Dana.
It's Dana Marshall with Transnational Strategy Group. Ambassador Fatemi, it's very nice to see you again. Thank you for those comments. I wonder if you could describe a little bit what you think is in Mr. Imran Khan's mind when he looks at China and considers the value of the China model for Pakistan's development. What features of the China model does he have in mind on the political side and on the economic side?
Well, China has gone through many phases, and the current phase, which was introduced by Deng Xiaoping after the third plenum of the Communist Party in early 1979, is actually a hybrid system whereby the state monitors and very carefully regulates the functioning of the private sector industries. But even the private sector is largely owned by government agencies. Now that cannot be replicated in Pakistan. In fact, our own experience of government owning major enterprises has been a very poor one. And in fact, one of the efforts made by the PML-N, which did not succeed, was to privatize things like the steel mill and the PIA. So the China model is more of a political slogan because the China is seen as a success story, and it sells very well that if the Chinese could do it, if the Chinese could maintain a high growth rate for 30 years going, maybe we can do the same. I think the Imran Khan government will want the package that was finalized between the two countries when President Xi Jinping visited Islamabad in April 2015. They will ask it to be expanded. And one of the elements that the PML-N government could not do because it came in very late is there is an agreement between the two countries that China will assist in establishing very large industrial zones in all the provinces of Pakistan, to which they will encourage their own industries, which wish to move because of the high wages in China and because of the proximity of Pakistan to the Gulf and to Central Asia. So those are the kinds of things that the Imran Khan government could do. The other thing they could consider and are likely to consider is to get massive Chinese assistance for the construction of dams and water reservoirs. That is something also that we had been considering and had raised, but not at sufficiently, with sufficient vigor and at a high level. So other than that, I don't see. But yes, Imran Khan will continue, as I stated, to bank on China, to depend on China, and to continue to further fortify and strengthen those ties.
We have a question here.
Yes, Ambassador, thank you. Howard LaFranchi with the Christian Science Monitor. You mentioned disappointment in Pakistan at Secretary Pompeo's statement on seeking an IMF package. But I'm wondering, how is it interpreted in Pakistan? How is that statement interpreted, and what is thought to be behind it, and what does it portend for U.S.-Pakistan relations?
Well, thank you very much. The charitable view is that this is an administration which loves to speak without due preparation. But the more serious observers were surprised, as I stated, and disappointed, because whatever package Pakistan does get from the IMF will come at the end of a long and tortuous process of negotiations, in which the IMF will impose very stringent terms and conditions. So it's not as if the IMF is giving us a gift basket of 5 or 10 or 15 billion dollars and we'll be permitted to do with it whatever we want. Which is why, as I stated, this remark was unnecessary and really did not serve any purpose other than to provide additional ammunition to those who wish to see the United States always in a negative light.
Fatemi Sahib, if I may ask one last question, and then we'll promise to let you go at this time. And this is something that I think we have, Mr. Asad Umar, you mentioned the finance minister in waiting, also talk to us in a couple of minutes. You mentioned the FATF and the problems that will arise because of that. You mentioned the IMF, of course, we've talked about that. Could there not be a case made by the PTI that actually that's the mess the PML-N government has left for them, rather than something that, you know, they have created, of course?
Well, in politics, you can make any claim, and one does. But we had worked very hard, and we had actually managed to come out of the grey list in 2015. Subsequently, I think the momentum was lost and things happened. I was no longer in government, so I'm not aware of the details. But I'm told that after the last meeting, the organization has given them a paper and asked them to do certain things in terms of the banks, in terms of the lending institutions, in terms of the transfer of money from outside into Pakistan, from Pakistan to other countries. And the finance ministry, the foreign ministry, and the Federal Board of Revenue, they have all been working on it. And I think their responses have gone or are about to go. So the government of Pakistan does recognize that it has to do certain things that are essential if you want to come out of the grey list. So that is there. Now, as far as the IMF package is concerned, the things actually started collapsing after Mr. Nawaz Sharif was constrained to leave office after the Supreme Court judgment in July 2017, I think. Yes, 2017. And things started drifting. Otherwise, the situation was much better at that point than it is now. In 2013, when the PML-N came to power, the situation was equally bad, and Mr. Ishaq Dar had to negotiate a package from the IMF, as well as we managed to get some assistance from both China and Saudi Arabia. I think the new government will follow more or less the same path.
Got you, got you. Fatemi Sahib, thank you so much for joining us and giving us your and PML-N's perspective. We'll continue the program here and we'll catch up, of course. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you, Moeed, and please convey my thanks and good wishes to all your participants.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks. Okay, so we have our next guest online. We've talked about the question of the hour, which is what will the new government do? How will they manage the situation they have? We've also heard a mention of the finance minister in waiting. So we have none other than that gentleman, Mr. Asad Umar, who is joining us again via technology. Asad Sahib, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so very quickly, just to introduce Mr. Omar and then turn it over to you. As I said, he's probably the only one whose portfolio has been known for a long time, even before the elections. He is the person who will be dealing with much of what we talked about in terms of the economic crisis. And I think I wouldn't be exaggerating if I said that the new government's short-term legacy will probably be determined by what he's able to do in the next 3 months or so in terms of the economy. Mr. Omar comes from a private sector background. I believe is one of the youngest, if not the youngest CEOs of a major private sector conglomerate, the Engro Corporation. He worked with them for 27 years. And if you are in Pakistan and in the private sector, no matter which angle, you can't miss his name. Again, somebody who we've known for a while and is a good friend of the Institute, has spoken here before. Also is the recipient of the Sitara-e-Imtiaz, which is one of the highest civilian awards that the Pakistani state provides or gives its citizens for public service. Mr. Omar, we've heard from Syed Naveed Qamar Sahab from the PPP, from Syed Tariq Fatemi Sahab from the PML-N talking about the elections, and we're very keen to hear from you in terms of the PTI's outlook, perhaps the elections itself, but where do we go from here? Of course, you will have the task of managing the economy, but there's also the question of relations with the US. I will just put on the table that the coverage that we've heard in the US, there's been a lot of discussion about the elections themselves, about Mr. Khan's previous stances on some of the issues that matter to the US. So I think our audience would be very interested in hearing your views. So with that, it's over to you.
Hello, everyone. I'm slightly confused. It's I guess I should be saying good morning.
Yes, 10:30 in the morning.
10:30 in the morning. Okay. So I'll keep my opening remarks brief because I'd rather talk about what people have on their minds there rather than talk about what's important for me. In terms of a quick comment about the election, Pakistan is a country of weak institutions. Democratic practices are not established. So the mere fact that after an election there are allegations of wrongdoing is more the norm rather than an exception. I guess the only exception is the response that we have made to these allegations of wrongdoing, of rigging. And that stance was first stated actually the night of the election itself. Mr. Shabazz, the president of PML-N, did a media talk where he said there were serious irregularities. And then on behalf of the party, I responded. And that response of mine is the stance which we are still continuing to hold on to, which is any and every opportunity should be given to investigate, to review any wrongdoing that has happened, what is popularly known in Pakistan as opening the ballot boxes. If there is need to do that, please go ahead and do that. Just a reminder to the audience there that the interim government which conducted the election or was overall in charge of the country was put in place by the PML-N and the PPP. The election commission appointments were done by the PML-N and the PPP. And therefore, PTI had no role to play in any of the people who were conducting the elections this time around. Anyway, having said that, let me talk about the challenges, and I'll stay focused on really a couple of related issues, and then as I said, then I'll stop my initial comments there. And that is, we are facing a significant external account crisis. And that external account crisis is well known, it's well documented. There has been a very severe deterioration of our external account from a time when the PML-N government came in 5 years back of an external current account deficit of $2 billion in a year to a situation where in the last 3 months we have been running current account deficits of $2 billion a month. So it's gone up 12-fold, and clearly this is not sustainable. So given that the most urgent action required of the government will be to deal with this external crisis. In that, obviously we'll try and explore all opportunities available to us, but the decision has been left so late that you will have to look at all options available on the table. And I've been saying this using the exact same line even before the elections. No option can be ruled out you could argue is the most likely option also, but I'm not in a position right now until we have official access to data, until we can open discussions with bilateral and multilateral institutions to be able to make a call on that. So that's the most immediate crisis that is being faced. At the same time, there is something which in a way is linked to that, there is also something impending which is a potential opportunity. And if you heard Mr. Khan's speech the day after the election, he talked about the importance of peace in Afghanistan to Pakistan and his hope for peace there. And if you ask me in the last 1 week, since the 11 or 10 days, whatever it's been, what are like some of the highlights of the messages that have come through, then one of them is there seems to be widespread hope for a breakthrough in Afghanistan. And obviously this is not going to happen overnight, and we're not going to have peace in Afghanistan starting next month. But a real sense of a opportunity where all factors are coming together, and there is a possibility of Afghanistan moving towards a permanent peace and reconciliation. And the two, as I said, the issues are linked because Pakistan's economic prospects are weighed down by what's happening in Afghanistan and the region. Pakistan's relationship with the world, and in particular with the US, are seen, if not largely, then to a great extent, through the prism of the Afghan situation. So obviously it's a vital issue for Pakistan, both in the immediate future as well as in the longer term. So that there is sense of optimism, at least on that front. The acting ambassador of the US had just come to call on the Prime Minister-elect, and I'm actually coming straight, and we shared the same views with him. That's our sense, and his response was that they also believe that the US administration also believed that there might be positive possibilities opening up. So in that context, it's a bit unfortunate that Mr. Pompeo decided to make the statement that he did, even before we had decided to go and formally get into a discussion of the IMF program. But anyways, those are his views. We would obviously be looking at a future foreign policy of relationships, both East and West, and are therefore and are able to play a positive role in contributing towards peace in the region. We are very cognizant of the fact that Pakistan's economic potential, and what is most foremost in the minds of Imran Khan, he keeps on talking about, and I heard what will Imran Khan learn from China, and specifically what he keeps on talking about is we must learn from China how to bring such a large number of people out of poverty in such a time. So with that desire to lift people out of poverty in Pakistan, we are cognizant of the fact that regional trade and peace in the region is absolutely vital for making that happen. So with that desire, that's what's going to drive the foreign policy choices that are made. And we look forward to constructive relations with all important countries in particular. And of course, the US is and remains and will continue to be one of the most important, if not the most important country in the world. So we look forward to a constructive relationship with the US as well. So those are my opening comments, and I'm open for questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much for providing us that perspective. Let me turn to our panel. We have Jumaina Siddiqui here and Dan Markey. And then we'll also ask the audience to ask you a few questions before we let you go.
Asad Saab, thank you. So PTI rolled out an ambitious 100-day plan, and other speakers have said that it will remain just that, a plan. But if you could comment, besides the economy, what would be the first set of initiatives that the government would want to roll out legislatively? And my second question is on FATA integration. Because for the first time, an incumbent government in KP has won again the provincial assembly. FATA integration, I think it will be a major hurdle and activity of the provincial assembly in KP. What are PTI's plans? What is the roadmap for FATA integration?
So we won't have to wait very long. In a matter of 100 days after the government takes over, we'll know whether it just remained a plan on paper or it was a living document which we tried to implement. And I think it would be fair to say that much of our legacy will begin to be established within that 100-day period and made ourselves answerable. So we are hoping that there will be progress along the lines as outlined in the 100-day plan. In terms of the legislative action that you're talking about, the current structure of the parliament is such that we have a majority in the National Assembly. We will be in the opposition in the Senate or in the minority in the Senate. So the legislative ability of the PTI government to make significant changes is going to be limited. It will have to be brokered. It's kind of like a U.S. administration which has the opposition part in the lead in the Congress and Senate. That's the kind of situation that we'll be facing. But most of the stuff that we've talked about in the 100-day plan and which are the priorities of PTI, most of those things do not require any legislative changes. The laws are in place. It's a matter of going and changing priorities. It's putting focus on implementation and making things happen. Therefore, this relative constraint on legislative capacity should not be an impediment for making most of the agenda happen. FATA reform and FATA integration is absolutely vital for a lasting peace in Pakistan. I would say that it also has knock-on effects to peace in Afghanistan also. PTI championed this cause, and when the expiry of the previous assembly, a FATA bill was being brought in, which in our opinion was inadequate. We are the ones who took up a stance against it. Finally, everybody agreed to what we were saying. So we will be moving full speed ahead on the integration. There is an administrative vacuum there. There is a political vacuum in FATA. So a lot of military or security success has been achieved in operations in FATA. But if we don't very, very quickly move in and fill that political and economic and administrative gap, then you can see a rollback of the situation in a scenario which nobody would want to see. So FATA integration will be one of the priority areas for the PTI government.
Thank you. Dan?
Thanks also for your opening remarks, really very useful. And I'm curious, though, to step back, and since this is mainly an American audience listening, to try to get a sense as to how different a PTI-led government, a government led by someone who hasn't enjoyed national-level positions of leadership, unlike the other two parties that have alternated in power in Pakistan for now decades. What are we looking at here? Is this, if you can could you put a name to it or describe the model of governance and leadership that you anticipate seeing? Because it's happening all the time in the popular media. Is this the Donald Trump of Pakistan, or the Erdogan of Pakistan, or who is Imran Khan? How should Americans interpret him as best as we can?
Okay, I'll be polite and I won't even ask you whether that was a compliment or not. He certainly can't tweet as interestingly as Mr. Khan does. Okay, first let's understand what the PTI phenomena is. How has PTI suddenly found itself to be in power after a situation where pretty much Pakistan was faced with a two-party system? This is the result of a increasing clout of a growing middle class. And the middle class aspirations are now getting expressed in the political mainstream and starting to dominate the political narrative of the country. It is governance, it is reforms in the economy, it is a fight against corruption, it is strengthening of institutions. So that's what PTI has been talking about. That's what found traction, and that's what made PTI the force that it is at this point in time in Pakistan's electoral politics. And therefore, the natural extrapolation from that is that those are the kind of things that you will see, which will be the priorities of the PTI government. So you'll see a lot of emphasis on creation of transparency, strengthening of institutions, reducing political interference in these institutions, changing the priorities and the resources from trophy projects to investing in humans and the kind of things which resonate with the middle class. I mean, to put it very simply, that's if you want to understand how a PTI government might function and what its thought processes might be, you should talk to somebody who really understands the Pakistani middle class and the way they think, which, in my opinion, is not very different from middle classes in any of the emerging countries. So that's how I would frame it. And in terms of Imran Khan, what would be different? I think Imran Khan has the ability to take positions which are politically can be what word should I use? Not dangerous is too strong a word, but which entail political risk. And if he believes that that's what will result in the long-term good, then he has done that in the past. He has done that as an opposition leader. He has done that in KP in governance. The kind of reforms which got pushed through in the health system there required serious political will. And that's the one quality I think that you can look forward to in terms of the comparison with Donald Trump, with lack of significant administrative experience. Although now he has had not directly but indirectly the 5-year experience of KP, so he understands the governance system much better than he did. But still, he'll obviously be going through a learning curve, and therefore you might see adjustments in his stance or adjustments in how he operates as we go through the first 12-18-month period, as opposed to a Nawaz Sharif, who we know exactly what he would do once he's in power.
Thank you. Let me turn to the audience and have a few questions, and we'll keep you for another 10 minutes if that's okay.
Sure.
The lady there in the middle.
Hi, I'm Jessica Donati with the Wall Street Journal. I was interested to hear you were saying that Afghanistan peace is one of the important things for Pakistan to move forward. So I was wondering, what is it that Pakistan can do to help bring peace to Afghanistan, and what is this government going to do different? Because all the previous governments have said that they are working to help. So I was just wondering how this one is going to achieve different results.
One, as I said, is simply a question of emphasis. Because it's so central to the thinking of Imran Khan, to our view of what Pakistan needs to do to go forward. So you'll probably see a lot more emphasis on the foreign policy than you did earlier. And if I may say so, you might see much greater political involvement in the foreign policy as opposed to the security establishment on much of the responsibility of that relationship. We have a prime minister or prime minister-elect who is very familiar with the terrain which sits next to Afghanistan. His mother comes from a tribe which is from the belt right next to Afghanistan. It's something which is close to his heart emotionally as well. So not just the view of Pakistan as a country and the geostrategic considerations of Pakistan, but also at a personal emotional level. This is an area. And what shot Imran Khan to prominence in the political system in Pakistan was FATA. So it's much more central to his politics, to his person, than it was to the previous leaders. So apart from any specific policy stance, just that emphasis is, in my opinion, going to be a very, very significant difference. In terms of specific policy actions, the road going forward, if if the US-Taliban one national government dialogue proceeds, then obviously there is a lot of political support that is brought in with Imran Khan as Prime Minister, because it was his stance that there is no military solution, that you will have to get into a dialogue, which got him labeled as Taliban Khan, which is one of the most absurd nomenclature I've ever heard. But that's what he strongly believes in, and that's why the fact that the US one national government and Taliban are getting closer to a initiation of the dialogue process than has been the case in the past puts the policy stance of the US completely in alignment with the fundamental ethos of Imran Khan as a person, not just as a party position. So I think there is, as I said earlier, room for optimism.
Yeah, back there.
Hi, this is Varda Khalil from Voice of America. PTI's government is going to establish a government in a few days. I wanted to ask you, what are the challenges, domestic challenges, you see are most difficult to handle at this moment? And another thing is that corruption has been...
Keep it to one so that we get
okay.
other people. Yeah.
So I would just say that how are you planning to handle the corruption in all the financial departments or all the government departments which is facing now?
Okay, just a very quick comment on your first question, because if I start answering that, then I won't have time for your second one. And that's what's most urgent is the economy, and I've already talked about it, so I won't make further comments about it. But the continuing fight against extremism and terrorism in the country is a continuing challenge, and so that will be one of the major priorities. There are issues which have arisen out of a restructuring of the federal structure of Pakistan through the 18th Amendment and the 7th NFC Award, which needs revisiting. So that's another thing that needs to be handled. The different federating units of Pakistan have made progress, but there are still actions that need to be taken to strengthening the federation, and those are specifically identified in our 100-day action plan also. So those are some of the highlight areas which will take most of the government's time in the initial few months of the administration. In terms of corruption, there are like two different aspects to it. One, as I said, is creating transparency in the governance system, strengthening the institution and creating political insulation for them so that political interference is stopped, and putting in structures which are robust, which create empowerment, but at the same time accountability of those institutions and the people who are heading those institutions. So that is one aspect of it. The second aspect is the strategy institution, the National Accountability Bureau, and putting the full power of the executive behind that bureau. So very often in the recent past, it seemed that the executive is at loggerheads with the Accountability Bureau, and changing that into a partnership and strengthening the institution and providing whatever support needs to be done. The final aspect of fighting the corruption are the international actions that we will be pursuing. Primarily out of the consequences of the war on terror, there have been a lot of changes in global financing laws in terms of transparency requirements, etc. There is the OECD mandatory mutual exchange of information treaty. There is the unexplained wealth order in the UK. There are changes in the Dubai real estate and banking system. The Swiss banking laws have changed, and so on and so forth. And we want to take advantage of all these changes which have happened in terms of increased transparency requirements, and pursue the ill-gotten wealth of Pakistanis, which is sitting in these international domains, in tax havens, and frankly in the in public view in the real estate market and the property market of London as well. So that is going to be a major part of the anti-corruption effort, because what's happening is the nexus is you do corruption in Pakistan, you do money laundering, and you go park your assets abroad so that your illicit wealth is not visible in the country. So that's going to be a major drive and a major initiative which will be started in the very first 100 days.
Thank you. We'll take 2 more questions and then we'll let our guest go. I'm going to try and get to people who haven't asked questions before, just in the interest of fairness. So the gentleman here.
Hello, my name's Rowan Reid from Internews. One of the areas where the previous government was fairly active was to gradually reduce the ability of international NGOs to operate in that country by introducing the NGO registration laws. What's the PTI's view in terms of allowing international NGOs to operate within Pakistan?
Okay, in terms of having foreign NGOs operating in Pakistan, the need for registration and good close review is important. We support that because a lot of the activities which have taken place in Pakistan over the last 50-20 years, and that's from various different sources which have created problems for the country, have come in the shape of charity financing. So there is, we fully support and endorse the need for regulation, but at the same time, what you don't want to do is create obstruction in the path of those who are trying to help the country and help its citizens. So while regulation should be there, but it has to be streamlined, it has to be effectively implemented so that it achieves the purpose of ensuring that that there is no entry into the country of participants who will cause any kind of problems, but at the same time does not become an obstruction to those who want to do good.
Okay, and we'll take the last question here. Yeah, all the way down.
Hi, this is like a more economics related question, but you've briefly mentioned the idea of reforming the direct taxation plan. So I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that and also kind of the timeline. I know you've also mentioned like changing the bond system and some other economics related things. I was wondering if, yeah, you could just elaborate on direct taxation and how that might play in.
You want to introduce yourself?
I'm Sarah Malik. I'm with the Department of State, but this is a personal question.
Moeed, the internet connection is...
Sorry, say that again?
Moeed, can you repeat the question? The internet connection was a bit wobbly.
I see. The question is, you've talked about the economy, you've talked about changing sort of the bond structure perhaps, you've talked about direct taxation. Can you elaborate on what that really entails and what you're looking at in terms of how you're going to implement that?
Okay, the 2 or 3 big things that we've talked about. One is there are a large number of state-owned enterprises which operate under the domain of different ministries. And we have said that we will take all of these out of the domain of the line ministries. We'll create a wealth fund, a sovereign wealth fund, and we place all of them under that wealth fund, have professionals who have business expertise and corporate background to run those institutions, rather than have bureaucrats and politicians who know nothing about this and running them into the ground. And they should then decide which of these are ready for privatization and need to be privatized, which for the time being are going to be kept in government control and so on and so forth. So that's one structural change that we are making. The bond that I refer to is a diaspora bond. There is a lot of interest right now in overseas Pakistanis. The PTI is massively popular amongst the educated overseas Pakistani diaspora, and they want to, and obviously Pakistan is facing a current account crisis, so we want to match the two and create investment opportunities, investment instruments where the overseas Pakistanis can make investments back into the country. And the first instruments that we will be using are a bond or a sukuk, which is like an Islamic bond, which are debt instruments, but we will then be working on some equity instruments also, which can be made available to the overseas Pakistanis to invest back into the country.
Okay. Thank you very much. We are out of time, but I will use my privilege, if I may, Mr. Umar, to ask you a twin question, which is raised here often. I'm surprised nobody's asked it, but I am asked this question often, and I'm basically guessing and pretending, so I want you to answer this. Both are things that are close to the hearts of people who work on Pakistan in this town. Both are controversial, but I do want to put it to you. One is the question of China versus US for Pakistan. There is a question here increasingly whether CPEC and sort of Pakistan's engagement really means it is now China and not the US, or whether it is still the US and China, and how that squares up. The second one is, you've talked about Afghanistan, you've talked about the US, but one of the questions I get often is, how much control does the PTI government or any civilian government ultimately have over those accounts? So even if you want to do what you're saying, are you able to?
Okay, as far as the first one is concerned, USA is the sole superpower in the world right now. China is an emerging superpower. These are the two largest economies in the world. So for any country in the world, it makes sense to try and have positive, constructive relationships with both of them. So from Pakistan's point of view, clearly it would not be in Pakistan's interest if it became an either-or relationship. At this point in time, unfortunately, let's look at the narrative which people of Pakistan hear. When they hear China, they hear power plants, road networks, sports. When we hear about the US, it's about Pakistan harboring terrorists. So if you listen to the public narrative right now, in the public narrative, I haven't seen any of the latest research surveys which ask this question, but I would not be surprised if people in Pakistan are starting to form an opinion that China is a friend of Pakistan where the US is not. That's not how strategic decisions by nation should be taken, and that's not the way we would hope that the relationship unfolds as we go forward. The US and Pakistan have had a long relationship, checkered relationship, no doubt, but by and large, a good relationship. And clearly it would be in Pakistan's interest to build on that relationship and for it not to become a relationship where Pakistan in any way is now starting to become an ally of China against the US interests. So we certainly hope, and that's why we are a bit troubled by the latest the trade war which is erupted between China and the US, and I think it is not just in Pakistan, in everybody's interest that there are better relationships between the China and the US also. So that's my take on the Pakistan, China and the US thing. We also, by the way, just before I go off the US, I hope at some point in time in our relationship, bilateral relationship, we will be able to develop a non-hyphenated relationship. We've gone from one hyphenated relationship to another, from Indo-Pak to F-Pak, and hopefully at some point in time it will just become a Pakistan-US relationship. As far as, what was your second question? Wait, I'm getting old, I forget.
That's a convenient one to forget. It's about the idea, that comes up here, which is, even if the PTI government says it's going to do certain things on Afghanistan or India or US, do you actually have that account? Are you able to?
Okay. I'll give you my non-professional, personal reaction to this one.
Sure.
My sense is that at least some, if not a large part of this narrative, has actually been used by our political governments to find excuses for their conduct. Okay. One thing which I am absolutely sure of, and I hope I'm never proven wrong on this one, is that Imran Khan in particular and PTI in general will stand by the decisions we take. We will not, even if, let's assume for a minute, that in a closed room we try to sell a policy and we're not able to sell it, and in the end we adopt a policy which is not what we thought was ideal, we would still never come and sit with foreigners and tell them we actually wanted to do something else, or stand in front of the nation and say that we don't have control. If Imran Khan does not have control, Imran Khan will want to go home. I'm pretty sure of that. I know the man. I think where Pakistan stands right now, it is in Pakistan's interest for there to be strong, positive partnership between the civilian and military relations institutions. The military is a strong institution in Pakistan. It's got institutional capacity. I was called Moeed to speak at the Staff College, the premier training ground in Quetta, and on the topic of civil-military relations. And I did an analysis of why the relationship has been a problem. And one of the reasons that I stated was asymmetry of capacity. The military has significant institutional capacity in terms of policy development on national security issues and foreign policy issues. And this policy capacity is increased over a period of time, and the civilian capacity is eroded over a period of time. So it makes sense for a Pakistani leadership to make full use of that institutional capacity. But in the end, the decisions are political decisions, and the political leadership has to stand up and take those decisions. Sure. The US establishment plays an important role in the formulation of US national security strategy and foreign policy decisions. Donald Trump ran an election campaign on the promise of a complete exit from Afghanistan, ended up increasing troop presence in Afghanistan. Sure. So, and that change, almost certain, happened as a result of input from the military establishment, the security establishment of the US. Nothing wrong with that. So it should be a strong partnership. It should draw upon the strength which is there with the military. It should not be an adversarial relationship, but in the end, the buck stops at the table of the Prime Minister, and he should not make excuses for the decision he takes.
Thank you. This has been wonderful. I know you have an economy to manage, and you've taken more time than I asked for. Thank you very much for joining us, and the very best of luck with your portfolio. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank you. Thank you. Wow, I don't think I've managed technology for 90 minutes that hasn't failed. He gave a few jitters, but it worked. It worked. So thank you to our IT team and Emily at the back of the room. Let me quickly switch to the panel now, because I do want to leave time for the audience to ask questions of you. I have two basic questions, which I'm going to put for you. One, where do you come out on this question of the positive democratic consolidation, sort of the movement, second, 10 years, etc., versus the question you raised with Naveed Qamar, which is this a regression at the end of the day? I quite frankly can see both sides of the argument, but I think it'll be interesting to get your take. And the second question I wanted to ask you was exactly what Mr. Umar raised at the end, the civil-military conversation. And I'll be honest, I'm increasingly picking up a total disconnect between the conversation about Pakistan in the US and the conversation about Pakistan in Pakistan. And Pakistanis, I think, have begun, the conversation is not about Afghanistan. It's not about India anymore. It's really about internal issues which are pressing. And the US-Pakistan relationship, as you know, has gotten to a bit of a one-point agenda for the past year or so. It's only Afghanistan. So is there even a conversation to be had, even if the PTI government puts its foot forward to say, we want to have a bilateral conversation? Is there one to have? Or is it really still this question of Afghanistan, and then whether it's a civil or military? Because I think, there's an interesting point here. There's a government, the competency of the civilians is low. I'm going to use where the capacity is. From the US perspective, on the outside, it seems like it's a domination of the military again. So how does that square?
I can kick it off in terms of response. To me, and we've had this conversation before in other settings, this idea of consolidation and progression versus regression and kind of the hollowing out of Pakistan's democratic governance is a central one. So every time Pakistan has an election, to be clear, there are two things going on here, and it's sometimes difficult to disentangle them. One is the natural competition, the partisan competition, which is perfectly healthy and happens everywhere and should happen in Pakistan as well. The howling and kicking and screaming and everything like that, that's normal democratic politics. And that's not a sign necessarily of unhealthiness. Even howling over process is not necessarily a problem, because it's only through the howling that you have any potential possibility of improving it. Mm-hmm. But in Pakistan, unlike, I would say, in a fully consolidated democracy, you have this underlying concern that, in fact, democracy is not healthy and that it's withering away. And that's something different. And there, I think we should look at a couple of things as we go forward. One of them is governance style and process of governance. So, if Asad Umair is correct in his interpretation of the trajectory going forward, and there's more transparency, more accountability. Things function in Pakistan, including in the parliament, the way that more like how they were designed to function, then we're seeing consolidation. But what we've seen in the past, and part of my concern, for instance, with the PML-N government, certainly when Nawaz Sharif was in charge, is that you didn't see a parliament that was acting in any way that came close to, legislation. What? Showing up to parliament and actually having votes that passed legislation and ran the country? Forget it. What you had was a kind of a full consolidation under a big man rule that looked entirely undemocratic in terms of the way that it actually functioned in the country. And when you see that, and you see the perpetuation of that, you do have to ask, is this just that really thin veneer at the top where you have elections every so often, the transfer of power to some new figure who governs in that same deeply undemocratic way? So that's what I'll be looking for. And that feeds naturally into this next question of, the subsequent issue is how do they govern, but then also what do they control? And do they, in fact, control their foreign and defense policy? Do they control budgets? Do they control who gets what? And the answer has been a pretty clear no, particularly on the budgetary side of things, for the past decade. And so when the question is, okay, so Imran Khan might be very much more inclined to see the world through a lens that looks more like the one that the military tends to use. But when it's a guns versus butter issue, which is very much what they're facing right now, just how much leeway does he have to make those decisions? That's another kind of way to calibrate democratic consolidation and civilian control over government that we have to watch closely.
Okay. Jumaina?
So I'll take the first part of it and dive into some of the technical issues. Contrary to what Tariq Fatemi Saab said, I have only been tracking elections actively since 2008, not as many as he has seen. But we've seen at least a growth in the understanding of the technical nature of how elections are being held in Pakistan, whether the conversations are on what party agents are saying. This is the first time that party agents have actually come out and actively said we were prevented from witnessing the count because they knew what forms to ask for. They knew what the processes were. And I think that's important, and it's a step in the right direction for democracy in Pakistan. The other issue is that as parties have matured, that there is now this third party. PTI has taken a huge stance and become a third party that has come into power. I think it's important for Pakistani democracy. I think the real question, which there's very few conversations, no one's really commented, is a shrinking space for dialogue, open dialogue without the fear of retribution. And that has been closing since 2008. Under the Musharraf government, there was a freer media. Civil society was able to be more active. But as we've seen with progressive, democratic elections and democratic governments coming into power, we're seeing the reduction of civil society space and dialogue and discussion and debate. People are more worried about what they'll say openly in cafes, at events, at panel discussions in Pakistan than ever before, I think. That's I think the negative aspect of this growing democracy, and I agree completely with Dan that this is, you see the process of elections happening, and that's great, but then how they're actually governing after they get into power, and what instruments that they're passing in legislation-wise to allow for more freer dialogue and discussion in Pakistan. That's, I think, the worrisome thing, and it remains to be seen how PTI will then move forward. I was with allowing for more debate and discussion, healthy debate and discussion, whether it's on the floor of the National Assembly or within civil society organizations and the media.
Okay. Yes, sure.
Just I thought these, by the way, this Skyping or whatever magic we used worked really well, and it's really great to hear from Pakistan. And the people that you selected were excellent, so thanks personally for that. I just wanted to make an observation, maybe useful, which is that it seemed, particularly from hearing from the PTI, that there's a possibility that you could get a convergence of a lot of good things going together. And this is where I'll be watching to see if that can actually materialize. So particularly on the IMF, one could imagine a situation, you hinted at this as well, Moeed, where you have the new government comes in and blames the old government for making a lot of errors, casts political blame on them and therefore is somewhat freer to go ahead with an IMF package. In doing so, it also is eager to be more transparent about its dealings with China and open up the books on some of these things because it can say, hey, those are the last guys, that wasn't us. So
that's what they've said they will do.
Exactly, so there's an openness there. The Chinese have said, by the way, that they wouldn't mind that. At least some of the Chinese have said that, and we'll see if that's true too. Another good thing that we would be looking for. The US would be inclined to support, or more inclined to support an IMF package if all that transparency is in place, because then the concern that we, through the IMF, would be bailing out the Chinese loans would be reduced. And the PTI could come out, at least a near-term relative winner in all of this, because politically it would, again, have cast the blame elsewhere. So that's all the good things going together. The bad part is IMF also has other conditions, which include probably some austerity kind of measures, which will be deeply unpopular and run very much counter to what the PTI at a populist level would be preaching. One other, and I'll be very quick on this, Asad Umair has a very appealing voice and kind of presence, certainly from an American perspective. The presumptive or potential defense minister, Shireen Mazari, has a very different perspective and makes very different claims about the nature and the proposed nature of the relationship with the United States. So which PTI is going to come to play is a big question here, and I'm glad you got this voice for our session. But we'll all be watching to see which one actually holds the cards as we move forward.
Sure, we will. Let me turn to the audience and see if there are any questions for our panel, and then we'll come back here. We are really threatening to be on time, which is a shocker when I moderate, but great. Andrew, you have to wait. The gentleman here.
Hi, Andrew Crane from International Christian Concern. Pakistan has been a Tier 1 country on the United States Commission for International Religious Freedom on their report for a while now. And I was just wondering, with the PTI-controlled government, do you see them doing anything about the blasphemy laws, which is a large reason for them being a Tier 1 country on CPC?
Sure. The one?
You can pick it up.
I can comment as well.
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
So the blasphemy law, to be all honestly, it's a very touchy subject. The fact that there have been discussions and debates on the protection of minorities throughout this election and or calling out minorities is something new that we've seen in this election period. It remains to be seen what PTI will do. Members of their party have come out against some of the minority groups and have said some very slanderous statements against minorities. But Imran Khan, on a positive note, in his speech after the election, has said that protection of minorities and working across ethnic, sectarian, religious groups is something that is of importance to us as a party, as a national, wanting to be a national party. So I think in the weeks and days ahead, we'll see what Imran Khan will say and do, and the party will do to address these issues. But again, the blasphemy is the kind of like Medicare here. It's a third rail of Pakistani politics.
And for that reason, my answer would be much simpler. I don't anticipate any positive change whatsoever. It's not politically, it is radioactive. There is no upside. There can be and probably should be voices from the outside raised on this issue to make it clear that people care and that Pakistanis ought to care. And I think this is a fight that will continue to rage in Pakistan. But positive progress by this government out of the gate is the last thing they'd want to pick up.
This gentleman here. Right here.
Thank you. Phil Schrafer, retired international healthcare worker. Afghanistan, there was some optimism expressed about reaching some kind of understanding with Taliban and so on. Who could this possibly be? Because when you had your conference on Afghanistan before, the United States was not perceived to have any real, despite the meeting of the ambassador with the Taliban, there's very little likelihood, given how we pulled the rug from outside under the Iranians, and we seem to be dominated by military thinking. What other country could work with Pakistan to bring some kind of understanding there?
I mean, look, I think, first of all, I would step back and say, over the past weeks and months, there has been, if not a sense of likely progress, at least some significant effort by U.S. diplomats, by the government in Kabul, and it seems, and some opening by the Taliban to have these conversations. I don't want to oversell that as a breakthrough. Everybody ought to be skeptical, and even if this worked as best as it possibly could, it would take years and years. But keeping that in mind, we shouldn't overlook it. And then the question is, so who else could kind of get Pakistan to advance that agenda? And there the answer over the past almost decade now has been China. That hasn't worked terribly well. And China's been less willing and able maybe to carry our water on this issue than I think some American policymakers might have hoped. That doesn't mean we shouldn't keep trying. And the question is, will the Trump administration continue to place kind of a coercive pressure on Pakistan first, couple that perhaps with its IMF agenda, and try to tie all of these things up together? And I think as much as Pompeo's remarks are seen as unhelpful and unfriendly in Pakistan, that's what they're intended to signal. All these things go together. When Washington and certainly the White House looks at Pakistan, it sees all these issues together and through an Afghan lens. Whether that's healthy or not, that continues to be the reality. And this administration does seem to be dedicated to both fighting the war in Afghanistan and pushing ahead with these talks. So that's how it's seeing this agenda. We'll see if that'll pay off. At the best, it'll take time. Yeah, lady here.
Hi, this is Najma Pizada. Dan, you mentioned a very thin veneer of democracy since 2008. What are the factors you're looking for to change in the next 5 years to show that democracy has deepened within the country?
Well, I think I got at this just a little bit before. Parliamentary procedure is one. Control over budgets, transparency with respect to that. Jumaina made a point about public debate. I think that's a very important one. And media was raised before as well. The quality of media debate, a sense of openness and accountability, these kinds of things. Those are steps toward progress. Now, many of them are difficult to measure, and that's part of our challenge. But they're not impossible to see. And I think in a lot of ways, what I have perceived has been backsliding on a number of these issues. I'm not sure I would go so far as to say it was better under Musharraf, but I would certainly say that we haven't lived up to the promise and the hope of 2008 by almost any measure. And that's part of what actually has motivated the campaign and those who have supported the PTI, which is anti-corruption agenda, as was said before, a kind of a middle-class agenda, reform, accountability, and so on. These would be positive steps.
I think to that I would also add strengthening of local government. These are the first elections that were held after local government laws have been passed and local government elections had been held. So it remains to be seen. PTI has done a good job of supporting and developing robust local governments in KP, and whether they can deliver that to the rest of the country and provide the same type of support across the other provinces would also be, I think, a positive step towards ensuring democracy. But the capacity of local governments and even provincial governments is still weak, and it still needs support, whether that's in the form of how you manage the relationship between the central government and the local government, or whether it's international donors coming in and providing technical assistance and support to help strengthen how local governments and provincial governments function.
If I could just, I think this is a really important question. In consolidation of democracy, you have legitimacy components and effectiveness components. Legitimacy, I think, that is the kind of area where more public accountability, more public debate will reinforce legitimacy if it's handled well. That doesn't necessarily always go hand in hand with effectiveness. That is, if I'm Imran Khan and I'm coming into power and I've got a thin majority, a bare governing coalition in Parliament, do I want to take every issue to Parliament to be debated and hounded and taken forever through that process? Probably not if I'm looking for efficiency. So managing that balance is also going to be a critical component. And that's not easy. And as somebody said to me yesterday, it's kind of like Barack Obama when he came into office. He must have been asking himself, did I really want this job? And Imran Khan, I think, is going to feel the same way. He's a man who enters office in an economic crisis that needs to be handled almost immediately. Living up to promises is going to be very difficult.
Every state leader asks this question, and the answer is always yes, no matter what. So I think the answer is yes. So we have Andrew, then we have the gentleman here. We have 5 or 6 questions. Why don't we actually take 3 here, and then give you a chance, and then 3 more, and then we'll end at that. All right.
Vincent Wafaso, unaffiliated. Talking to town in Washington has always been Pakistan funding terrorist groups, and the U.S.-Pakistan relationship. Is there another elephant in the room in Afghanistan in terms of India-Pakistan relations?
Okay.
Moeed, I've heard you a lot.
I'm not here to speak today.
And, I've always heard that argument coming from a lot of South Asia analysts. And just briefly, how about Indian public opinion of Imran Khan? Is this a break from tradition in Pakistan? Is the break away from the past attracted Pakistani voters?
Okay. You have a question? Yeah, right here. Right here, yeah.
Vivek Shivaram from the International Republican Institute. I wanted to ask a little bit more about the China-Pakistan relationship, specifically about what the current sort of calculus of the security establishment is towards that relationship. And given that PTI in the past has criticized aspects of the CPEC deal, particularly around the opaqueness of it, do you see any friction between the security establishment's view towards China and that of a PTI government?
And then Andrew at the back, and then we'll come back and then go.
Thanks, and thanks for giving me 2 questions, Moeed.
Job security, my friend. Go for it.
Asad Umar, tried to position, PTI is the party of the middle class, and certainly I think that did play an important role in PTI's performance. Obviously, I think for me, the perception of who's going to win an election in Pakistan is a very strong determinant of voting behavior, because why waste your vote for a losing party in a patronage-based system? So I think the perception of establishment support also played a significant role in that process. But of course, also, PTI did better, particularly in Punjab, because of, I think, giving a lot of seats to non-PTI quote-unquote electables. And I guess my question is now, what do you see as the PTI doing in terms of party development? We really haven't talked about that now. To me, there's a real opportunity for the PTI to maybe be the first prominent Democratic Party that's not a dynasty. I think his children are a little young still. And will the PTI, is there any evidence that they're starting to think about, strengthening the party institutions at the grassroots level, really trying to build a political party in Pakistan, which I think could really be an opportunity for it to consolidate power and perhaps win another election, rather than, again, just be a passing phenomenon?
All right.
I can take the last one.
Sure.
I'm happy to start with that. So in 2012, prior to the 2013 elections, there was issues with whether PTI had the necessary infrastructure and grassroots support to win the election. There was the popular opinion that Imran Khan and his PTI wave was going to take over, and they fell short. But they took the opportunity in KP to develop the party and develop structures, more transparent and open elections within the party. So they have made steps. I think there's still a lot that needs to be done, and I think over the last 5 years between 2013 and 2018 that they have made strides. But, and this is something I had asked prior to the elections as well with the PTI folks, what are you doing? How are you playing? What is your grassroots game? You can't just sit from Islamabad and run a party and attempt to win seats. So yes, getting non-PTI folks and these these electables and these independents on board has been a positive, but whether they can manage to hold them together, especially as these independents who have won seats, will they be able to help them govern within the National Assembly? Again, remains to be seen. Yeah, no, I think the perception of it being a middle-class party, like if you talk to people from the middle class in Pakistan, they have been supporting, they said that he needs a fair chance, he understands the needs and our issues. But again, running a campaign and then governing are two totally different things. And so over the next 12 to 18 months, I'm interested in what the rhetoric will be coming from PTI, if they're still going to cater to the middle class, or will they have to face the reality of actually governing and making tough decisions like the IMF austerity measures that will probably be put into place, and how that will impact the middle class, and whether that will wane their support moving forward, especially in local government elections as they come up in about 1.5 to 2 years.
Just to add one more line, Andrew, I think we should also start looking at the changes in terms of how party structures are developed. I mean, PTI actually did a Mitt Romney in some ways. They developed applications, technology basically, to get voter base without having to reach out in terms of patronage like the status quo parties do. So it's going to be very interesting to see how they pull it off. But that app apparently played a big role in getting PTI to know who their voter was going to be.
Yeah, I would, just picking up briefly on that point, this looks like what you might call new populism more than old machine politics. It's something that I think we're seeing globally, and it's partly technology and not just social media, but broader communications, telecommunications, outreach potential, big data, these kinds of things. And it doesn't have to, so Pakistan doesn't have to have another PML-N going forward. Doesn't have to be dynastic in that way. If you look at Modi in India, you would also raise similar questions. Is this any longer a kind of a broad machine politics in India? Yeah, there's some of that, but it's also this kind of new thing, which is individual charismatic leaders able to reach out through a variety of means directly to the voter, or almost directly to the voter, less mediated through local politicians than historically. That's a big change in the development of party structures. It doesn't necessarily bode well for good governance or the management of democratic governance in the way that we might have hoped to see it, not just in Pakistan, but elsewhere, or even here, right?
So the India, Pakistan, and China?
Right. So let me pick up the China-Pakistan one. I think this is a really fascinating question. PTI has been somewhat critical of CPEC. Others have been critical. And so how do you reconcile that criticism with the apparent also backing, or at least comfort level of the military with PTI? My brief answer would be, I think these things are going to be harmonized very quickly. In other words, I think PTI was opportunistic in its criticism of CPEC. I think it'll come on board very rapidly, both for good political reasons, that is, there are resources to be had, and there are gains to be made, and there are wins in terms of building things and providing things to Pakistani people that are available to the party that they will not want to forfeit. I think the Chinese are willing to play. And so I think that will be something that they can mend relatively quickly and take responsibility or be rewarded for fixing what was broken about the way the PML-N did it. And so I think there's a lot of upside there, and it's all easily in line with what the military presumably would want as well. So those things go together. So I think that friction will be smoothed over. With respect to India and Afghanistan, yes, of course, Pakistan, we do ourselves a disservice by discounting the extent to which many Pakistanis see India as the concern in Afghanistan. If we don't understand that, we're missing a big piece of the story. At the same time, objectively, from an American, Washington-centric perspective, India is not the problem in Afghanistan, or it's not the only problem, and it's certainly not the main problem. And so we also do ourselves a disservice if we hold, I believe, our strategies and our policies hostage to Pakistan's perspective of India and Afghanistan. So how do you reconcile those two things? Well, that's the problem. But so we need to hold those two realities in our heads at the same time and move forward with a policy based on that.
So we're on time, but I did, if it's okay, take a couple more questions very quickly with brief answers, and we'll end there. the lady here and Dana, and then we'll end. Please keep it short so that we can give our speakers a chance to wrap it up.
Samira Daniels, this is for Daniel. In light of what you just said about the perception by Pakistanis that India is the problem, the reality is that India and Pakistan have problems with each other. So if you were Imran Khan, what would be the maybe the first, in rank order, the 2 or 3 steps you would take to ease some of the conflict situation?
Dana, very quickly.
I wanted to see if I could have the panel drill down a little bit about what Mr. Omar said, and a very optimistic point regarding the Alice Wells conversations with Taliban and Qatar at the same time as Imran Khan has got his own contacts there. Can each side take yes for an answer at this point?
Can each side take yes for an answer at this point? Yes. I guess, look, I would just say hold on, be prepared for a long process. And this to me looks like a bit of fresh air, that is some dialogue being had between parties that were up until now having it only very infrequently. Ambassador Rafel's in the room. You can talk to her about how some of the backstory here, I gather, from what I read. But and I think this is all to be welcomed. But this is a much, I guess I just want to impress on everybody, the need for patience and it being a long-term process means that even if we could get yes from everybody, there's going to be a lot of steps along the way. And on this other point, if I were Imran Khan, what would I do with respect to India? I would hold on and try to not have any problems with India until India gets through its elections, because nothing good is going to happen between now and the end of those. And Pakistan has a whole bunch of other problems, and we heard about them, that it really needs to focus on first. That is, it needs to figure out a way to get out of this current economic crisis. So don't anticipate that, and I think one of, it was maybe Ambassador Fatemi was saying, that India has been very difficult to deal with. Don't anticipate that India will be a whole lot easier to deal with just because Pakistan has a new leader. India is inclined not to be terribly patient with Pakistan for lots of reasonable reasons. And so don't expect that to change. Just hold on and just don't make waves. And I think that his initial messages to India, campaigning notwithstanding, but his post-election message was intended to do exactly that. Not to say anything terribly negative, and try to look for opportunities to at least smooth things over. That's about the best that we can hope for the near term.
Jumaina, last word?
No,
Good.
I'll let Dan have that last word.
Well, thank you very much. You will agree that we did pull off a technology miracle, so I want to thank our IT team at USIP for doing this. Emily Ashridge at the back of the room, who actually manages all of this, and I take all the credit. Thank you, Emily. Thanks to our speakers from the political parties, our panel, all of you. I'll just end by saying that I think it's a fascinating moment for Pakistan analysts, because Pakistan is in the midst of a real political science experiment. Because if you talk to Pakistanis about democracy, what you find are two views. One view that says, well, we've allowed elections to continue, but it's patronage-based, these parties are corrupt, they're dynastic, they're not interested in governance, and thus this is not going to improve. Pakistan has also tried military rule, doesn't seem to fix the problem. We've also had a government in the Pakistan People's Party, 2008 to 13, who were fairly remarkable at legislating, brought in very, very active parliamentary politics. We have a PML-N government that's just left, that didn't care about the parliament, but did a lot of big infrastructure development. All of that compromised by this idea that their politicians are corrupt, they're weak, etc. Here you have a government outside of the system. Nobody challenges the Prime Minister-elect on corruption, at least. You've got a government that is not beholden to traditional patronage lobbies, so technically doesn't have that excuse. And the flip side of what we've been discussing in terms of the elections and so the pre-poll situation is that there isn't the kind of disconnect starting off that we saw in the previous government. So to my mind, when people ask me, what do you think, I always tell them I worry. Because this to me is the last political science experiment left in that sense. You've got all the indicators that Pakistanis say are not present in this particular situation. And so we'll wait and see where we end up. It's going to be a very interesting 5 years ahead of us. Thank you very much, and please join me in thanking the panel.